What if one of the most luxurious car factories ever built in America was now nothing more than an empty, silent ruin? A place that once symbolized wealth, innovation, and industrial power, now left abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by time. In the early 20th century, the city of Detroit was not just another industrial center, it was the heart of the American automobile revolution. Factories stretched across the city, smoke rose from massive industrial buildings, and thousands of workers moved in and out of factory gates every single day. This was the place where the future of transportation was being built, and among all these factories, one stood above the rest, not because it was the largest, but because of what it represented: luxury, precision, and a level of craftsmanship that few could match. This was the factory of the Packard Motor Car Company. Long before mass-produced cars dominated the roads, Packard had already established itself as a symbol of excellence. Its vehicles were not made for everyone. They were made for those who could afford the very best. Business leaders, wealthy families, influential figures who expected more than just transportation. They wanted comfort, style, and engineering that reflected their status. Inside the Packard factory, every car was built with attention to detail. Workers were not simply assembling parts, they were crafting machines, polished metal, carefully shaped components, engines designed for smooth, powerful performance. Each vehicle that left the factory carried the reputation of the company, and that reputation was built on one simple idea: quality above everything else. The factory itself was unlike most industrial buildings of its time. It was designed with modern principles. Large open spaces allowed for efficient production. Natural light entered through wide windows, creating a working environment that was considered advanced for its era. This was not just a place of manufacturing, it was a symbol of progress. At its peak, the Packard factory employed thousands of workers. Entire sections of the building were dedicated to different stages of production, from raw materials to finished automobiles. Every step took place within this industrial complex. The scale was enormous, and the output reflected that. Packard cars quickly gained recognition across the United States. They were known for their reliability, their smooth ride, and their refined design. Owning a Packard was not just about having a car, it was about status, a statement of success. For years, the company thrived, demand remained strong, production continued at a steady pace, and the factory remained a central part of Detroit's industrial identity. But even at the height of its success, changes were already beginning to take shape. The automobile industry was evolving, new companies were entering the market, and not all of them were focused on luxury. Some had a very different idea. Instead of building cars for the few, they wanted to build cars for the many. Affordable, mass-produced, accessible to the average American. It was a shift that would change everything, because while Packard focused on craftsmanship and exclusivity, others focused on speed, efficiency, and scale. Factories became faster, production methods improved, and costs began to drop. This created a new kind of competition, one that Packard had never faced before. At first, the company remained confident. Its reputation was strong, its customers were loyal, and its factory continued to operate at full capacity. But the industry was no longer the same. The rules were changing, and the question was no longer just about building the best car. It was about surviving in a market that was becoming more competitive with each passing year. Inside the factory, the machines kept running. Workers continued their routines. Cars rolled off the production line. But outside those walls, the world was moving in a new direction, a direction that would eventually challenge everything Packard had built. And as history has shown time and time again, even the most powerful industrial empires are not immune to change. What was once considered untouchable can slowly begin to fade. This is the story of how one of America's most respected luxury car manufacturers rose to greatness, and how its massive factory, once filled with life and activity, would eventually become one of the largest abandoned industrial sites in the world. By the time the early decades of the 20th century began to unfold, the name Packard Automotive Plant had already started to carry a meaning far beyond a simple automobile manufacturer. It represented prestige, a symbol of success, a statement that the person behind the wheel had reached a level of wealth and influence that set them apart from the ordinary. Inside the factory, this idea was not just a marketing message, it was a philosophy. Every machine, every component, every detail was built to reflect a standard that few competitors could match. Workers did not rush their tasks, they perfected them. Because in this factory, speed was not the priority, excellence was. The production process itself was carefully organized. Unlike the fast-moving assembly lines that would later define the automobile industry, Packard followed a more refined approach. Each section of the factory focused on precision. Engines were assembled with attention to balance and performance. Metal panels were shaped and polished to achieve a flawless finish. Interior elements were crafted to provide comfort that felt closer to luxury furniture than standard vehicle design. The result was not just a car, it was an experience, one that began the moment the engine started and continued with every mile on the road. Customers quickly recognized this difference. Packard vehicles became known for their smooth performance, quiet engines, and reliability, but more importantly, they became known for their identity. Owning a Packard was not about transportation, it was about belonging to a certain class of society. This reputation spread rapidly. Business leaders, politicians, and wealthy families began choosing Packard over other brands. The company's slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," reflected a confidence that came from real customer satisfaction, and inside the factory, that reputation created a constant demand for perfection. As orders increased, the scale of operations expanded, more workers were hired, more sections of the factory were activated, production levels rose steadily. The building itself became a symbol of industrial progress. Large windows allowed natural light to enter the workspace. Open layouts improved efficiency. For its time, it was considered one of the most advanced automotive factories in the world. The environment inside was intense, yet controlled. Machines operated with rhythm, workers moved with purpose, supervisors ensured that every stage of production met the company's high standards. It was a system built not just for output, but for consistency, and it worked. Year after year, Packard continued to strengthen its position in the luxury automobile market. Its vehicles gained recognition not only in the United States, but also internationally. Exports increased. The brand became associated with quality on a global scale. For a period of time, it seemed as though nothing could disrupt this success. The factory remained active, the workforce remained strong, and the company's identity remained clear. But while Packard focused on maintaining its reputation for luxury, the rest of the industry was evolving in a different direction. Companies like Ford Motor Company were introducing new methods of production, mass production, assembly lines designed to produce vehicles at a much faster rate, cars that were not limited to the wealthy, cars that could be owned by the average American family. This shift began to reshape the market. Suddenly, the question was no longer just about quality, it was about accessibility, speed, and cost. For Packard, this created a challenge that was not immediately visible. Its customers were still buying, its reputation remained strong, and its factory continued to operate at high capacity. But beneath the surface, the foundation of the industry was changing. The gap between luxury and affordability was becoming more significant, and the number of customers who could afford high-end vehicles was limited. At the same time, the number of people who wanted affordable transportation was growing rapidly. This imbalance would eventually force every automobile manufacturer to make a decision, adapt to the new system, or remain committed to the old one. Inside the Packard factory, the focus remained unchanged. Precision, quality, craftsmanship, the values that had built the company's success. But outside those walls, the pace of change was accelerating. New factories were being built, production methods were becoming faster, competition was increasing, and the idea of what a car should be was evolving. For a moment in time, Packard stood at the top, a symbol of luxury in an industry that was beginning to move toward mass production. A company that had mastered its craft, but was about to face a future that demanded something very different. And as history would soon reveal, even the most refined empires can struggle when the world around them begins to change. There was a time when everything inside the Packard Automotive Plant felt unstoppable. The factory floors were alive with motion, machines operated with precision, workers moved with confidence, and every section of the building reflected a system that had reached its highest level of efficiency. This was not just a period of growth, this was the peak, the moment when everything the company had built over the years came together in perfect balance. Production lines continued at a steady pace. Each vehicle that rolled out of the factory carried the same identity that had defined Packard from the beginning: luxury, performance, craftsmanship. There were no shortcuts, no compromises. Every detail mattered. Inside the engine rooms, skilled technicians carefully assembled components designed to deliver smooth and powerful performance. Engines were tested, adjusted, and refined until they met the exact standards expected from the brand. In the body assembly sections, metal panels were shaped and aligned with precision. The finish had to be flawless. Even the smallest imperfection was unacceptable. Further along the production process, interiors were crafted with equal attention. Seats were designed for comfort. Materials were selected for quality. Every element of the car was meant to create an experience that went beyond simple transportation. For customers, this attention to detail made all the difference. Driving a Packard was quiet, smooth, effortless. It was a reflection of status, a symbol that the owner valued quality above all else. At this stage, the company's reputation was firmly established. Its vehicles were recognized not just across America, but in international markets as well. Orders continued to arrive, demand remained consistent, and the factory operated at near full capacity. From the outside, it appeared that nothing could go wrong. The workforce was strong, the systems were refined, and the brand carried a level of trust that few competitors could match. But within this success, small signs of pressure were beginning to appear. They were not obvious, not at first. In fact, they were easy to ignore, because everything still seemed to be working. Yet the industry itself was changing faster than ever before. Across the country, new factories were being built with a different philosophy. Speed over precision, volume over exclusivity. Companies were no longer focused only on making the best car. They were focused on making the most cars and doing it faster than ever. One of the biggest forces behind this shift was Ford Motor Company. Its assembly line system had transformed automobile production. Cars could now be built in a fraction of the time. Costs were reduced, prices dropped, and suddenly, owning a car was no longer limited to the wealthy. For the average American, this was a breakthrough. For companies like Packard, it was the beginning of a challenge. Because while Packard continued to focus on luxury, the market itself was expanding in a completely different direction. More people wanted cars, but not necessarily expensive ones. They wanted reliability, affordability, and availability. Inside the Packard factory, this shift was not immediately reflected. Production continued as it always had. Workers followed the same processes. Quality remained the top priority, but the numbers told a different story. The gap between demand for luxury vehicles and demand for affordable cars was growing wider. Competitors were selling in higher volumes, reaching larger markets, expanding faster. Meanwhile, Packard remained within its established identity, and for a time, this seemed like the right decision. After all, its reputation was built on excellence. Changing too quickly could risk losing what made the brand special. But the question was no longer just about identity. It was about survival in a rapidly evolving industry. As the years passed, the pressure became more noticeable, sales growth slowed, competition increased, and the market began to shift in ways that could no longer be ignored. Inside the factory, subtle changes began to take place. Production targets were adjusted, strategies were discussed, decisions that once seemed unnecessary were now being considered. There was a growing awareness that the industry was moving forward, and that standing still might not be enough. Yet even with these changes, the factory continued to operate. Machines kept running, cars continued to be built. From the outside, the image of success remained intact. But beneath that surface, uncertainty had begun to take hold. The perfect balance that had once defined the company was starting to shift. And as history has shown time and time again, the moment just before decline is often the moment when everything appears strongest. Because pressure does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it builds quietly, gradually, until the system that once seemed unbreakable begins to change. At first, the pressure inside the Packard Automotive Plant was something that could be managed. It existed in conversations, in meetings behind closed doors, in small adjustments to production and planning. But over time, that pressure began to take shape. It became visible, real, and impossible to ignore. The automobile industry was no longer what it had been just a few years earlier. Competition had intensified. New companies were entering the market with aggressive strategies. They were faster, more adaptable, and most importantly, they understood something that Packard had been slow to accept. The future of the automobile industry was not limited to luxury. It belonged to the mass market. Companies like Ford Motor Company had already proven this. By focusing on efficiency and affordability, they had reached a customer base far larger than anything Packard had targeted. Cars were no longer symbols reserved only for the wealthy. They were becoming part of everyday life, and this shift began to reshape the entire industry. Inside the Packard factory, the impact of these changes was gradual but undeniable. Orders were no longer growing at the same pace. The steady increase that had once defined the company's success began to slow. Production targets became harder to maintain. Inventory started to build up in certain sections, and for the first time in years, uncertainty entered the system. Workers continued their tasks, machines continued to operate, but the rhythm had changed. There was a difference. A subtle tension that could be felt across the factory floor. Supervisors paid closer attention to output. Management focused more on efficiency. Decisions that once emphasized perfection were now influenced by practicality. For a company built on craftsmanship, this was a difficult transition because the very thing that had defined its identity was now being challenged by the reality of the market. In an effort to adapt, Packard began exploring new strategies. The idea was simple in theory: expand beyond the luxury segment, reach a broader audience, compete with companies that were producing vehicles at a lower cost. But in practice, this shift was far more complex. The factory itself had been designed around a specific type of production, a system built for precision, not speed. Changing that system required more than just new decisions. It required structural change, new processes, new approaches to manufacturing, and perhaps most difficult of all, a change in mindset. Inside the factory, these adjustments began to take place. Some production methods were modified, efforts were made to increase efficiency, costs were reviewed and reduced where possible, but every change came with a challenge. Moving toward mass production risked lowering the quality that Packard was known for, and maintaining the same level of craftsmanship made it difficult to compete on price. It was a delicate balance, one that became harder to maintain with each passing year. At the same time, the market continued to evolve. Customers who once aspired to own luxury vehicles were now presented with more affordable alternatives, cars that offered reliability at a fraction of the cost. For many, the choice became clear, and as demand shifted, the pressure on Packard increased. Inside the factory, the effects became more noticeable. Production schedules were adjusted more frequently. Some sections operated below capacity, others struggled to keep up with changing requirements. The sense of stability that had once defined the operation was beginning to fade. Workers felt it, not always through direct communication, but through experience. Fewer consistent orders, changes in workflow, moments of uncertainty that had not existed before. The factory was still active, still producing, still functioning, but it was no longer operating with the same confidence, and as time passed, the gap between what Packard had been and what it needed to become continued to grow. Management faced difficult decisions. Should they fully commit to competing in the mass market, or should they remain focused on luxury, even if it meant limiting their growth? There was no perfect answer, because each path carried its own risks. Adapting too quickly could damage the brand's identity. Adapting too slowly could lead to decline. And in the middle of this uncertainty, the factory continued to operate. Machines ran, workers worked, cars were built, but the system that once felt perfectly balanced was now under strain. Because in the world of industry, success is not only about reaching the top, it is about staying there. And when the environment begins to change, even the strongest foundations can start to shift. For Packard, the moment had arrived when pressure was no longer something distant. It was no longer a possibility, it was reality, and from this point forward, every decision would carry consequences. The shift did not happen all at once. Inside the Packard Automotive Plant, there was no single moment when everything suddenly stopped. No dramatic shutdown, no instant collapse. Instead, the decline began quietly, almost unnoticed. At first, it appeared as small inconsistencies, production schedules that no longer felt as predictable, orders that fluctuated instead of steadily increasing, sections of the factory that once operated at full capacity, now experiencing brief pauses. These were not signs of failure, not yet, but they were signs of change. And over time, those small changes began to grow. The automobile industry continued moving forward at a rapid pace. Mass production became more efficient, competitors improved their systems, costs continued to drop, and cars became more accessible to a wider population. For many companies, this was a period of growth. For Packard, it was a period of uncertainty. The strategies introduced to adapt to the changing market began to show mixed results. Efforts to reach a broader audience created internal challenges, production methods were adjusted, costs were reduced where possible. But the balance between quality and affordability became increasingly difficult to maintain. The very identity that had once defined Packard was now being tested. Customers who once valued luxury above all else began to consider other options. Not because Packard had lost its quality, but because the market itself had changed. Reliable, affordable vehicles were now widely available, and for many buyers, practicality began to outweigh prestige. Inside the factory, this shift translated into something more tangible. Fewer consistent orders, longer gaps between production cycles, moments when machines stood still, waiting. At first, these moments were rare, short, temporary, but as time passed, they became more frequent, and with each pause, the sense of momentum began to weaken. Workers felt it, not always through official announcements, but through experience, changes in scheduling, uncertainty about future production, a growing awareness that the system they relied on was no longer as stable as it once had been. Some departments were affected more than others. Sections that depended on high-end production saw a noticeable decline in activity. Meanwhile, attempts to produce more affordable vehicles created new challenges. The factory had not been designed for rapid mass production. Adjustments could be made, processes could be modified, but the transformation required to fully compete with mass market manufacturers was far more complex. It was not just about changing how cars were built, it was about changing the entire structure of the operation. And that kind of change takes time that the company was quickly running out of. As pressure increased, decisions became more difficult. Management had to consider options that would have once seemed unthinkable, reducing costs further, restructuring departments, making choices that affected not just production, but people, because behind every machine in the factory was a worker, a person whose livelihood depended on the stability of the system. And as that system began to weaken, the impact became unavoidable. Some workers saw their hours reduced, others faced uncertainty about their future. The sense of pride that had once defined the workplace began to shift. It was replaced by caution, by concern, by the quiet understanding that things were no longer the same. Still, the factory continued. Machines ran when they could. Production moved forward, even if at a slower pace. From the outside, the image of operation remained, but inside, the reality had changed. The company was no longer expanding. It was trying to hold on, trying to adapt, trying to survive, and in doing so, it faced a challenge that many industrial empires have encountered before: the challenge of transformation. Because adapting to a new environment often means leaving behind the very identity that once defined success. And for Packard, that identity had been built over decades. Luxury, precision, craftsmanship, letting go of those values was not simple, but holding on to them came with its own risks. As the years passed, the gap between what the company had been and what the market demanded continued to widen. The factory, once a symbol of strength and progress, now stood at a crossroads, still active, still functioning, but no longer certain of its direction, because decline rarely announces itself with a single moment. It begins in silence, in small changes, in decisions that seem manageable at the time, until one day, the weight of those changes becomes impossible to ignore, and by then, the fall has already begun. There comes a point in every industrial story when the struggle can no longer be hidden. Inside the Packard Automotive Plant, that moment did not arrive with noise or chaos. It arrived with silence, a kind of silence that slowly replaced the rhythm of machines, a silence that spread across the factory floor, one section at a time. By this stage, the challenges that had once seemed manageable had grown into something far more serious. Production had slowed significantly, orders were no longer consistent, and the efforts to adapt to a changing market had not delivered the results the company had hoped for. The gap between expectation and reality had become too large to ignore. Inside the factory, the difference was visible. Machines that once operated continuously now stood still for long periods. Entire sections of the building remained inactive. The constant movement that had defined the factory for decades began to fade. Workers arrived, but not all of them had work to do. Some were reassigned, others waited, and some were told not to return. The decisions that followed were not sudden. They were gradual, carefully made, often delayed as long as possible, but they could not be avoided. Departments were reduced, operations were scaled back, costs were cut wherever possible, and with each decision the structure of the factory changed. Not physically, but functionally. Because a factory is not just a building, it is a system, a network of processes, people, and machines working together, and when parts of that system begin to fail, the entire structure becomes unstable. For the workers, the impact was immediate. This was not just a place of employment, it was a community, a routine that had shaped daily life for years. Generations had passed through these factory doors, families depended on the stability it provided, and now that stability was disappearing. The uncertainty was difficult to ignore. Each passing week brought new changes, new adjustments, new concerns. Some workers tried to remain hopeful, believing that the company would recover, that production would return, that the system would stabilize, but others could see what was happening. They could feel it in the quiet spaces where machines once ran. They could see it in the reduced activity across the factory floor. They could sense it in the decisions being made by management, because by this point the focus was no longer on growth, it was on survival. The company continued to search for solutions. New strategies were discussed, efforts were made to regain stability, but the conditions that had once allowed the company to thrive were no longer present. The industry had moved forward, the market had changed, and the structure that Packard had built was no longer aligned with the new reality. Inside the factory, the transformation became more visible with time. Large areas were no longer in use. Equipment remained in place, but unused. The energy that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more uncertain. Eventually, the moment that had been building for years could no longer be delayed. Production reached a point where continuing at the same scale was no longer possible. Operations were reduced to their minimum, and the factory, once a symbol of power and precision, began to lose its purpose. There was no single day when everything stopped completely, but there were days when entire sections remained silent, days when fewer workers entered the gates, days when it became clear that the end was no longer a possibility. It was a direction. The system that had once defined excellence had reached its limit, not because it had failed in its purpose, but because the world around it had changed faster than it could adapt, and in that moment, the reality became unavoidable. The factory that had once represented luxury, innovation, and industrial strength was no longer able to sustain itself in the modern landscape. What remained was not collapse in the dramatic sense, but something quieter, a gradual withdrawal, a slow disappearance of activity, until what was once a center of production became something else entirely, a space defined not by movement, but by absence. Because when a system finally breaks, it does not always shatter. Sometimes it simply stops. There comes a point in every industrial story, when the struggle can no longer be hidden. Inside the Packard Automotive Plant, that moment did not arrive with noise or chaos. It arrived with silence, a kind of silence that slowly replaced the rhythm of machines, a silence that spread across the factory floor, one section at a time. By this stage, the challenges that had once seemed manageable had grown into something far more serious. Production had slowed significantly. Orders were no longer consistent, and the efforts to adapt to a changing market had not delivered the results the company had hoped for. The gap between expectation and reality had become too large to ignore. Inside the factory, the difference was visible. Machines that once operated continuously now stood still for long periods. Entire sections of the building remained inactive. The constant movement that had defined the factory for decades began to fade. Workers arrived, but not all of them had work to do. Some were reassigned, others waited, and some were told not to return. The decisions that followed were not sudden, they were gradual, carefully made, often delayed as long as possible, but they could not be avoided. Departments were reduced, operations were scaled back, costs were cut wherever possible, and with each decision the structure of the factory changed, not physically, but functionally. Because a factory is not just a building, it is a system, a network of processes, people, and machines working together, and when parts of that system begin to fail, the entire structure becomes unstable. For the workers, the impact was immediate. This was not just a place of employment, it was a community, a routine that had shaped daily life for years. Generations had passed through these factory doors, families depended on the stability it provided, and now that stability was disappearing. The uncertainty was difficult to ignore. Each passing week brought new changes, new adjustments, new concerns. Some workers tried to remain hopeful, believing that the company would recover, that production would return, that the system would stabilize, but others could see what was happening. They could feel it in the quiet spaces where machines once ran. They could see it in the reduced activity across the factory floor. They could sense it in the decisions being made by management, because by this point, the focus was no longer on growth. It was on survival. The company continued to search for solutions. New strategies were discussed. Efforts were made to regain stability. But the conditions that had once allowed the company to thrive were no longer present. The industry had moved forward. The market had changed. And the structure that Packard had built was no longer aligned with the new reality. Inside the factory, the transformation became more visible with time. Large areas were no longer in use. Equipment remained in place, but unused. The energy that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more uncertain. Eventually, the moment that had been building for years could no longer be delayed. Production reached a point where continuing at the same scale was no longer possible. Operations were reduced to their minimum, and the factory, once a symbol of power and precision, began to lose its purpose. There was no single day when everything stopped completely, but there were days when entire sections remained silent, days when fewer workers entered the gates, days when it became clear that the end was no longer a possibility. It was a direction. The system that had once defined excellence had reached its limit, not because it had failed in its purpose, but because the world around it had changed faster than it could adapt. And in that moment, the reality became unavoidable. The factory that had once represented luxury, innovation, and industrial strength was no longer able to sustain itself in the modern landscape. What remained was not collapse in the dramatic sense, but something quieter, a gradual withdrawal, a slow disappearance of activity, until what was once the center of production became something else entirely, a space defined not by movement, but by absence. Because when a system finally breaks, it does not always shatter. Sometimes it simply stops.